You are listening to the Tricorder transmissions.
Drawing Trek, Episode 33, A Conversation with Doug Drexler.
And now, here are Jeff and Ian.
Hello and welcome back to Drawing Trek. I am Jeff Hewlett, and I'm of course joined by the venerable Ian Adams. How are things in the Pacific Northwest, sir?
Oh, doing great, and pretty excited today.
Why is that?
Well, we have a very special guest with us, Mr. Doug Drexler.
Oh my God, Doug Drexler's going to be on? Wait a minute.
We didn't even give him a proper intro. We just kind of dropped him in there.
Yeah.
Hold on a second. Let's roll back here. All right. So this is our 33rd episode of Drawing Trek. And today we're going to take a short break from our normal Gold Key comics coverage to bring on the very special guest who we already just introduced, who actually worked on a couple of issues of Gold Key, namely issues 47, This Tree Bears Bitter Fruit, and 48, Sweet Smell of Evil. We haven't covered those yet, but we will be in the near future. So please welcome visual effects artist, designer, makeup artist, illustrator, and two-time Emmy Award winner, Mr. Doug Drexler, to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Why, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
Gold Key. You know, I actually wrote a 2-pager.
For Gold Key Star Trek, or?
Yeah, it was called From Sputnik to Warp Drive.
Oh wow. Gonna have to track that down.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, those were the dim, dark days of Star Trek.
Yes.
There was nothing being made, and the show had been off the air a few years, but that wave of fandom was just starting to build momentum, and no one could quite believe what was about. No one would have believed what was about to happen with Star Trek. But you know, I lived in New York City, and we even had a Star Trek store that.
It's kind of legendary. The Federation Trading Post.
Federation Trading Post. Yeah, and we were at 53rd and 3rd, which is some really prime real estate. I'll tell you. I don't know how we ended up there. But I was also at the very first Star Trek convention in New York.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, it was it 1971 or something like that? It was across from the Penn Station, and they expected a couple of hundred people, and I think a couple of thousand showed up. And I think the fire marshal even threatened to close it down. But Gene Roddenberry was there.
Yeah.
And it was the first time Gene was running the projector, and he showed the blooper reel in the cage. It was the first time I'd ever seen the blooper reel. And of course, the Gene.
And the cage, that probably would have been, I heard that it was a lot of years that passed before anyone ever saw it in color. Was that in black and white when he showed it?
Yeah, it was in black and white. The story at that point was that Gene had a work print that they were working from when they did the Menagerie, and that the color print was supposedly destroyed in a fire at NBC. That was the story that was going around at the time. Eventually, Paramount released a version of it that was in color by using pieces that were used in the Menagerie. And so it would go back and forth. There'd be parts that it would be color, and then all of a sudden a couple of scenes would be in black and white. And then it would go back to color, and then scenes would be in black and white. Those were scenes that Roddenberry had in his work print. There was no full color print. And one eventually showed up. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah. So we want to start way back. How did you first get into Star Trek?
Well, I was a very literate kid, especially when it came to science fiction. And I read lots and lots and lots of it. Ellison, Asimov, all the Heinlein stuff, and Edgar Rice Burroughs. And I mean, I read all the time. And there was not a lot of science fiction out there in movies and television. There was very little in television. And it was basically something that people sneered at in the early 60s. It was, I know how my parents felt about that stuff. They thought it was like comic books. It was bad for you, you know. You weren't a thinker if you read that stuff.
Right.
So there were shows on TV that I enjoyed back then. I mean, the original Outer Limits was terrific, and I loved it.
Yeah.
That and Twilight Zone, of course, you know.
Yes.
But a lot of the space type stuff was, and hardware science fiction was pretty goofy, you know. I mean, Lost in Space was totally silly.
I was just going to go there.
Even as a kid, you know, I laughed at it. I still watched it anyway. I really loved it. As a matter of fact, I have a robot. Where is he? See my robot?
God. Oh, yeah. Full size.
Yeah, full size. Okay, in my garage, I have a full-size Uncle Martin spaceship from My Favorite Martian.
Wow. Yeah. Well, what about Star Trek, like, really caught your interest? Because it seems to be a real constant thread through your life.
It has been such a constant thread, and I never would have believed it. I mean, honestly, once the original series was canceled, that there would even be any future for Star Trek, and that I would somehow, become involved with it, is mind-boggling for me to this very day. I mean, it's been all through my life. When Star Trek first came on television, I wasn't allowed to watch TV at all. And I saw print ads for the show in newspapers and stuff. And I remember the art. It was that classic piece of art that was used on the James Blish books that shows the Enterprise spinning around and with smoke and flames coming out the backs of the engines.
I have some of those.
Of course, later on, I would learn that was painted by James Bama, who is one of my favorite artists of all time, and did zillions of book covers and stuff. And I went to a store, and they would have a big rack of paperbacks, and I'd be looking for books to read, and was always attracted by James Bama's covers for Doc Savage. He did like almost every cover of Doc Savage books, and those were high energy, high voltage covers. Every one of them was crackling with energy.
Yeah, my dad had all of those, and I remember just as a kid going through all the covers on them, and it took me a while to read them, as there was a lot of them.
Oh yeah, there was a huge number of them. Bama did really wonderful illustrations from men's magazines in the late 50s and early 60s. Just incredible stuff. You don't see that stuff anymore. Television and movies have and streaming and all. You just don't see magazine illustration like it used to be. You don't have it.
Yeah, even like the Gold Key covers. I mean, we've been gushing over what was his name, George. He did a bunch of covers for Gold Key. George Wilson.
Yes.
He did these beautiful painted covers, and they're just one of the real treats. Like, we'll easily spend like 5-10 minutes on every episode just
for sure.
going over Wilson's covers.
Well, I remember seeing some covers I really enjoyed that I liked. There was the Space Family Robinson, right?
Yeah.
But that was Gold Key, wasn't it? Space Family Robinson.
Oh, yeah.
I love the design of the ship in that. I thought it was really great. And then I could remember, it'll come to me. But their covers were different from the other comic book companies. They were sort of off doing their own thing, weren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Was it those covers that that really drew you into Star Trek, or that artwork, I should say, because it was artwork from those covers you said that you saw in print?
Well, it was a James Bama cover from the first Blish book, but there were other images and pictures and stuff, and I was intrigued by it, and I wasn't allowed to watch TV. And when it premiered, I couldn't watch it. I was in junior high school, and I went into school and had to hear from my friends that this was really good stuff. And I basically went on strike with my parents for 1 hour of TV, 1 hour of TV a week. And they finally gave in. And what I was struck by was, number one, Roddenberry was he had some writers that wrote scripts from books that I read, like Theodore Sturgeon and Harlan Ellison and J. Lewis Jerome Bixby and
Charles Beaumont.
So, the thing was that you knew whoever was behind the show was a science fiction fan. When I watched Lost in Space and Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, which I love the Sea View, I think it's a masterpiece.
Yeah.
And set design was great for the Sea View. But you could tell that Irwin Allen was no serious science fiction fan. It was,
Right.
pretty goofy, the Great Vegetable Rebellion and stuff like that. But I look back on it all pretty fondly, I love Dr. Smith and Will and the Robot, and
Right.
that was all great stuff. But at the time, as a snobby kid who mostly was a reader, there wasn't a hell of a lot, and I actually got to the point where I wouldn't even look at Lost in Space because it was an affront. I learned to enjoy it for what it was a little bit later. But I was a very snobby science fiction fan, and Star Trek was the best thing I'd ever seen on television. You knew damn well that whoever it was. I mean, later on, I got to stand on the bridge of the Enterprise with Gene,
Man.
and chat with them, and that's crazy. See, I ended up as a makeup artist, as I think you know, and I did prosthetic characters and stuff like that for 14 years, and ended up, when I got out to LA, we came out to do Dick Tracy. After that was done, they were in this, like the end of the second season of Next Generation. I'm like, oh my God, I'm here. I'm in Hollywood. I'm in the Union. I could actually work on Star Trek. I had had a dialogue going with Bob Justman while I was still in New York, and he was a producer on Next Generation, and he was from the original series. He was one of Roddenberry's original team on the original Star. And as a kid, I read The Making of Star Trek, which to me, and I guess I was 12 or 13, that was like an epiphany. I mean, I was that age, and of course, this is right after the World's Fair closed. I was reading The Making of Star Trek, and at that age, I was reading call sheets and production memos and budgets for sets and stuff. It was, now it's easy to find that stuff because with the internet, I could type in anything and get 10 billion hits.
Right.
But back then, it was whatever you could dig up in a bookstore or magazines. You had to really go after something to find it.
Yeah, I wish I had a camera on my computer so that I could show you. I'm holding in my hand my beat to hell copy of The Making of Star Trek. It doesn't even have the covers on it anymore.
Well, when we had the Federation Trading Post, best-selling books that went out of there were Franz Joseph's Tech Manual, and a Stephen E. Whitfield's The Making of Star Trek, which to me was like the book, the holy book. And I was in the Federation Trading Post one day by myself, and this big Norse-looking, a Norseman, Viking-looking guy with a red beard, and came up and actually sat on the front counter. And I'm thinking, what the hell? And he puts his hand out to me and he goes, Stephen E. Whitfield. And I was like, oh my God, no way. And he signed me a copy of the book, and his actual name is Stephen Poe. And I guess his father was a writer, and he didn't want to be confused with his father. So Whitfield was a pen name. But many years later, I'd be sitting in the Star Trek art department. I guess it was Deep Space Nine, and the phone rang, and it was for Mike and Denise Okuda. And I picked up the phone and I said, well, they're not here right now. Can I take a message? And the voice at the other end of the line said, tell them that Stephen Poe called. And I went, Stephen E. Whitfield Poe? And he was like amazed that I knew. And so became friends with Stephen Poe again. And he was around quite a bit because he was doing a book on a Voyager. And he was one of our pals. It was another one of those, in City on Edge of Forever, Spock describes time as fluid and like a river, and that there are eddies and backwashes, and we've all washed up at the same places, wild.
Yeah. Sure seems to be. Yeah. Those early reference books, the early fandom is something that I'm constantly fascinated by, because that technical manual, the Franz Joseph one, was what got me into Star Trek. And I know that you worked on a couple of them. I guess they were while you were working at the Federation Trading Post, or is that right?
Well, we did a really early fan publication that was the Starfleet medical reference.
Right.
I thought it was pretty horrible. But there are a lot of people who are very fond and nostalgic about it.
Oh, yeah.
We weren't pros really at the time, and it was just like we did it for fun, and we were selling it at conventions. And I guess it was Ballantine Books had just done the tech manual, and they saw it and they said, "This is ready to go. We'll print it," which is what they did. Since then, when I was on the show, we did the Deep Space Nine tech manual, and of course, Michael Koon and Rick Sternbach did the TNG tech manual, which I loved.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and you did the USS Enterprise Officers Manual.
Oh my
too.
God, yeah. That's right. That was one of those fan publications.
Yeah.
I did that, but then we also did a pamphlet, and it was with Jeff Mandel, who the Officers Manual was mostly Jeff Mandel. He was this kid that I met through the Federation Trading Post. He was like 14 years old, and he was doing incredible diagrams and blueprints of ships. Of course, back when you did it with a rapidograph,
right?
Used like chart pack tape, for lines instead of actually drawing them. And we were blown away by Jeff. And I eventually got Jeff started in the business by getting him a job in the art department, doing graphics on Deep Space Nine. And he's gone off and still a scenic artist on movies and things like that.
Man, that's amazing. The Federation Trading Post sounds like a real nexus for
it was
a lot of stuff.
I mean, especially at that time when there wasn't squat. Any TV show in Manhattan that was interviewing DeForest Kelley or Saturday Night Live was going to do a skit on Star Trek with Belushi and Aykroyd, and they Mad Magazine was going to do. They would come to us to get their reference or their uniforms and stuff. So we had a great time. I had lots of fun. Little did I know that was just the tip of the iceberg for me.
Yeah. So I've seen a lot of photos and stuff, and you would get a lot of people who worked on Star Trek that would just amble on into the show. Like, what do they think of it whenever they walked in there?
We did have, let's see, Nichelle came in, Roddenberry came by. Well, the Roddenberry thing was really, it was a steamy night in Manhattan. And it was and rainy and drizzly. And I remember I ran out to get a cup of coffee or something. And when I came back, my glasses were all foggy.
Oh, yeah.
When I came in. And one of the guys who was working with us, Mitch, says, "Doug, I think you should come here. There's someone here you should meet." And I'm thinking it's probably someone complaining or something about something. I walk up and I'm looking. I realize there's this wall of human being in front of me, and I'm looking into his chest. And so I look up so I could see his face. He's like over 6 feet. He's like 6'4" or something like that. And it's Roddenberry. And it was one of those things where I'm going back to look at him, and I almost kept going onto my back, because holy cow. Now I had seen Roddenberry at conventions at this time fairly regularly, but never really. You'd say hi, but never really was chatting. He used to go to the conventions, and my God, in the Manhattan conventions, not only would Roddenberry be, but Harlan Ellison would be there, and Isaac Asimov would be there, and there would be a floor in the hotel where it was just people like that who were staying overnight, and you would get to hang out and just listen to stories and stuff like that. So. Anyway, Gene seemed to really like it. I mean, he said that it looked like he thought it was really cool and that we seemed to be taking care of it. He could have made a fuss if he wanted to.
Right.
But, he was a smart guy and he always understood the fans. He never put the fans on the outside. They were always a part of it. Even when I was a kid, I would get, they'd be mimeograph basically, but letters from Roddenberry letting you know where things were and stuff like that. And when they did the first movie, he made sure there were fans filling the rec deck in uniforms,
Oh, yeah.
There's a lot of people who, because Gene was smart. He knew that by fandom feeling like they belonged, that fandom was really kind of an army for him. And they were back then especially, the fans were very, very get-it-done people. You know, you had to even be involved with it. Today, it's so easy to be involved and go on the internet, and there's still that form of fandom is still there, but you've got a lot of people who really, really are more like action adventure fans, and it's not about Star Trek and the philosophical bend to it, and they're watching it for the fast ships and the space battles,
Right.
And I really think that the true original fan really saw the philosophical aspect of it as being what was attractive about the show. So it's funny. Fans were always very, I hate to sound this way, but in the earlier days, the fans were much more accepting people. I find, of course, you'll find this anywhere you go on the internet, is you get a lot of aggressive, angry people, who are in there with the good-natured ones. And
Right.
I don't understand how you can be a Star Trek fan and not be open to all sorts of people and places and people from everywhere. The Star Trek's about infinite diversity. That's the philosophy of the show. How are you a Star Trek fan if you're spewing hateful rhetoric and stuff? I just don't understand that. But that's what happens with the internet. Everyone has a voice, and that is a good thing that everyone has a voice. But let's face it, there's some cranky ones out there.
I've had that same conversation amongst my group of Trek friends many, many, many times. I can agree with everything that you said wholeheartedly. Sometimes I'm surprised at some people who say they're Star Trek fans and have that hate in their hearts, or the.
I can't understand it, really. That's so anti-Star Trek. But people see in the show what it is they like. If they see space battles and weapons and explosions, that's, to them, that's what Star Trek is about. It never was for me.
Right.
No.
Gene was a guy who had witnessed war.
Yeah.
He was a pilot of a B-17 in the Pacific, and he knew what it was about. And it's easy, if you've never been through that, to think it's fun,
Mm-hmm.
Right. And glorify it.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, look, I enjoy war movies, and 12 O'Clock High is one of my favorite films, and but there are people who they don't really understand that. They see a war movie and they think that it's fun, and that's the way movies too. One of my favorite movies is Kelly's Heroes.
Oh yeah.
So it's better when you get a guy like Roddenberry to do a show like this. So the show, where it still has conflict, doesn't glorify it too much. I mean, I was a CG supervisor in the new Battlestar Galactica, which I thought was a tremendous show.
That was amazing.
Absolutely.
An amazing show, but it was an anti-war show. It's anti-war.
Mm-hmm.
It's mostly about being pursued and attacked by robots, killer robots.
Yeah, like I always thought it was telling that in the history of the fictional world of Star Trek, they got to where they got to after a devastating global war. Like that's kind of mirroring the experience that it sounds like Roddenberry had personally, and I'm guessing a lot of the other people who worked on that show in the beginning.
Oh yeah. A lot of them were had come out of World War II or Korea and stuff like that. Gene Koon, who was one of the major influences on the show, and a guy who was described as a writing machine, before he came to Star Trek, was known for military comedies. He had done some stuff on Broadway and some novels. And I was surprised to, if you look at the pilot to McHale's Navy, it's written by Gene Koon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I did not know that. So
you know that McHale's Navy had a pilot that was serious? It wasn't funny.
Wow.
No.
Didn't know that.
Yeah, you could dig it up. It was called McHale's Men, and it had Ernest Borgnine in it. And somehow they got the idea to make it funny. I don't know the exact story on that, but I've seen McHale's Men, and it's a drama.
Crazy. So back to the Federation Trading Post. One thing I want to know, actually, does Nichelle Nichols still call you Huggy Bear?
I don't. She doesn't even remember that. I mean, I've seen her numerous times since then.
That's a shame.
But I mean, at that point, we're talking. It was like 1976, maybe. So a long time has passed.
Yeah.
And I mean, she's within our circle of friends. I ended up knowing as friends a number of. I mean, Barbara Luna is like one of our best friends, and we regularly get together. Mike Forrest, who is Apollo, is one of our best friends, and we constantly. I'm like living with. I do joke with them that they're. I'm collecting full-size action figures here. But yeah, I mean, we had a barbecue out here one day where we had like 6 of the Star Trek babes. We're all here. You got to wonder. Sometimes I think that maybe I had a motorcycle accident when I was 18 and I'm bleeding out on the side of the road. And these are just all the things that, how a dying brain deprived of
Right.
oxygen is trying to give you what you were hoping for.
Right.
Because how could all of this be true?
So were you involved with the Federation Trading Post from the beginning? Because my understanding is that it started out in Berkeley. Is that right?
Yeah, it started in Berkeley. I was working in Manhattan. I guess I was in my early 20s, and I was working at an alarm company that actually had patrols that went out, and you were armed. And they had these electric protection, what they called it, on doors and windows and things. If someone broke in, you'd go and either find out what was going on there and fix the alarm. And I used to work nights, and I would rush home to see The Outer Limits. I think The Outer Limits was on like at 11 o'clock at night. Of course, there was no videotapes or anything. If you missed it, you missed it.
Right.
And so I would rush home and see it. And during it, there was like a 15-second slide just saying, the Federation Trading Post, the only Star Trek store in the galaxy, blah, 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 with the address. And I'm like, what? And it was just like a few blocks from where I was working. So the next day I went over there, and it was like a second floor walk up that had like a veranda out front, very unusual. And I could see them working in there. And I went in and I met this guy, Chuck Weiss, who started the Federation Trading Post in Berkeley. And we, the one thing I've noticed about Star Trek fans to this very day is that you can walk up to someone at a convention or us and be able to chat like you've known each other for a long time. And of course, Chuck and I hit it off right away. And he said, "Are you interested in a job?"
Huh.
And I'm like, holy crap, really? Come work at a Star Trek store? And so that's how I started there. And basically, Chuck was back in California, and I was with a guy named Ron Barlow, who Ron was a guy who was very much into the EC comics, and he published EC reprints that came out in the late 70s. They looked just like comic books. And he also printed a big red EC collection anthology thing. And so Ron and I ran the place, and we set up a museum, and we just had a ball. It was, we had one of the first freestanding molded plastic asteroid games that we had in the store.
Oh, wow.
And those were like, nobody had seen stuff like that yet. I think I saw one of them in the Charlton Heston movie, Soylent Green. And we got the very same one, and kids were pumping quarters into that thing all day long. And it got to the point where I was no longer riding the subway. I just go to the can and get a bunch of quarters out of it. I think I took a trip to Disney World based from quarters that came out of that machine.
Wow.
But yeah, we had a great time.
Oh, man.
Really fun.
Very cool.
So that was, from what you said, that was right across the street from Gold Key Comics, right? Is that how you got involved? And
Gold Key we were at 53rd and 3rd, and Gold Key was on 3rd Avenue. And I'd passed the building at Western Publishing. There was a plaque, downstairs. So I was like, oh. But that wasn't unusual in New York. I mean, I could walk over 3 blocks and visit Mad Magazine.
Right.
And see Bill Gaines and those guys, or I could go up to Marvel. I had been up to both of those places numerous times, and it's just New York is one of the creative capitals of the world. So it wasn't unusual to run into people. I remember I was walking along, and I could hear a guy behind me talking to 2 women, and he's talking about Mad TV satire he just finished illustrating. It wasn't Mort Drucker; it was Angelo Torres.
Huh.
And I knew it was Angelo Torres because he had worked for EC as well. And I was a big EC fan. And I turned around and I said, "Oh my God, are you Angelo Torres?" He was so amazed that I knew who he was. But yeah, New York was like, a publishing center. And I have to admit that I don't want to hurt anyone's feelings or anything, but the Star Trek comics that Gold Key did, we used to use as examples of Star Trek gone wrong.
Right.
It really, for me, it was like foreshadowing what would happen when J.J. Abrams took it over,
Yeah.
Because I would read the comics, and especially at that time, I don't know what they were like later, but I used to read them and look at them and say, have they ever seen the show?
That was what I was
Right.
going to ask you about, actually. That's something that Ian and I have been talking about for a very long time. I had no exposure to the Gold Key prior to a couple of years ago when we started covering them on this show. And I was kind of fascinated by the different takes that the writers had on Star Trek because they were far and away different from the show. And I don't know if you could shed any light on that, but do you happen to know what did they actually have access to? It seemed like maybe the early ones had a couple of headshots of Shatner and Nimoy and maybe a picture of the ship, and that was all they had to go on.
Well, the thing was that there probably, and I know this for a fact, there wasn't a lot out there. You could have gotten a lot of stuff from us. They may have, I don't remember if they bought stuff from the Federation Trading Post or not, but it really looked like they had a couple of shots and that was it. And
Yeah.
they couldn't record it or anything like that. I think we were just about to start seeing personal video recorders, which we actually had gotten one and were taping episodes. But it really looked like that they didn't have any proper reference, and it didn't feel a lot like a show. I mean, one of the things about Star Trek, and because of Roddenberry especially, was that he wanted the ship to run a certain way and have a certain internal logic to the way it ran, and you could see that when you watched it. And if you didn't run the ship, or even the way orders were given on the ship, it didn't seem right. It seemed there was something wrong,
Right.
Anyway, one day we're in the Federation Trading Post, and a couple of guys come in, and they're like, we do Star Trek. And I think I laughed just like that when they told me, because we probably had just been talking about it. And they're like, what are you laughing at? And I'm like, well, just like I told you, I go, we generally use your comics as an example of how Star Trek can go wrong. So much for diplomacy. But they were like, well, I mean, they didn't say this, but it was basically, well, if you think you're so smart, why don't you come over and we'll talk about it. And I thought that was pretty nice for them to say. But on the other hand, we are Star Trek experts, and we can help. And they had two stories, the two that I worked on, that I basically was given a free hand to go through and change the dialogue and things so that it would fall in more correctly with the show and the way people spoke.
Right.
And I also provided reference, and they even I had a meeting with not Al Williamson, but Al McWilliams. Do you know who Al Williamson is?
We just know that we know the name, basically.
Al Williamson was an artist that, for me, was most famous for doing EC comics, mostly the science fiction books. And he was a big Alex Raymond fan. He was a big Flash Gordon geek, and he studied Alex Raymond. I mean, if you've ever seen the early Flash Gordons by Alex Raymond, which was a newspaper strip, we're talking one of the greatest newspaper strips of all time. And so, I used to see Al Williamson at the comic conventions, and I even have a sketch of his that he did for me because I had a pretty girlfriend. There were people all around him at this comic convention, and because I had a pretty girlfriend, she was able to go right through and get him to draw something.
Gotcha.
But I still remember sitting with Al McWilliams, and I think that ultimately he thought I was crazy. But so I majorly rewrote two of them, and then I wrote a 2-pager, and that was all it was destined to do. That's all I did with them. I wasn't particularly enamored with the books, even. And no offense to Al McWilliams, but he wasn't really meant for Star Trek.
Yeah.
He's really more. He was an older gentleman, and I think he would have felt much more comfortable. I said, not to insult you, but there's a difference between Buck Rogers and Star Trek. Yep. A lot of his costumes on characters look like they were from 1938 Buck Rogers, But anyway, I mean, I'm actually surprised at how many people I've run into since then who are tickled that I worked on those.
Yeah. And issue 47 to boot.
Which one was that? Oh, 40. Oh, was it really?
Yeah, it was actually
No
issue
kidding.
47.
I didn't even realize that 47, the magic number.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah, we used it everywhere we could.
Yeah. Well, I had noticed in that, especially in issue 47, we're going to get into the actual issues in another conversation, but I noticed that it seemed to me like you specifically tried to add some continuity in there and some callbacks to the actual original series shows where that stuff rarely happened in previous Gold Key issues. I mean, Ian and I have seen it a little bit here and there, but you like call out specific episodes and things like that.
Yeah, which fans love that. I loved it, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah. I mean, I think that if you really want to get Star Trek fans hooked, you've got to take advantage of the incredible continuity that the show has exhibited over the last 50 years until J.J. Abrams.
Yeah.
I think that that's the key to its longevity, because people love to be able to read the encyclopedia, look at the history, and know it by heart. And that when they get together, they can banter milestones and dates around with each other, and they're in a private club. And it's also fun to know things that other people don't know, you know. When you start ripping up the continuity and throwing it out because you feel like what they had before sucked, and you're so much smarter than they are, so you might as well change everything. That's not why Gold Key was doing it, by the way. I'm talking about JJ.
Right.
Gold Key just didn't know anything about Star Trek. And it wasn't like they knew about it and said, oh, this is shit. I'm going to fix it, which is what's happened ever since, say, Enterprise was canceled.
Right.
Every version of it, the JJ, and I have to say Discovery as well, looks like that. It may be a good show, I don't know, but design-wise, it doesn't follow the timeline at all, which, okay, you know.
Yeah.
You get a lot of people who come in and they want to do their Star Trek.
Mm-hmm.
They want to, do it the way it should have been done in the first place. It's so amazing to me when it shows it's the biggest possible mistake you could make. Gene always knew how to work with the fans, and he understood that the show has to be chronologically true to itself in order for people to love it, you know. But I'm blathering away here. Sorry.
Okay.
Not a problem. So when you were working with Gold Key, I always imagine it as like a fairly small outfit. And I know that they worked with people like their first artist on the early Gold Key Star Trek issues was Alberto Giolitti, who is this Italian guy who I think lived in Italy.
He did.
So like what was their production pipeline like? That's something that we don't get to hear a lot about back in the day.
I really don't know. It wasn't like I went up there and there was a bullpen like Marvel or Mad Magazine. Although most of the artists, they didn't work at the office. I mean, there were a couple of times I went over to DC. I guess it was DC. And I was trying to become a comic book artist. And Joe Orlando was a editor there. And I was thrilled to meet him because he was one of the old EC artists.
Yeah.
And while I was there, I ran into Don Heck.
Oh, no way.
Who did Iron Man and, all that early Marvel stuff, and Millie the Model. But they would come in and out sometimes to get assignments or have a meeting, but generally everything was done at home. So, yeah, I don't know what the production pipeline was like. As a kid, I lived on Long Island for a number of years, and it hit me one day that a lot of these artists probably live out here on Long Island. And so I got out the phone book, and I found Don Heck lived around the corner from me.
No way.
Yeah, and I actually went and knocked on his door. And for a couple of summers, I'd go over to his house every other week or so during the summer with whatever sketches I was doing. And he was a bachelor. I mean, the house looked like it too. There were comic books all over the floor, and And he would throw a piece of tracing paper over my stuff and show me where I went wrong, which was really nice of him to do, Well, anyway, after Kirby left, this guy was put into doing a lot of Kirby stuff and was constantly being pushed by Stan Lee to do it more like Jack. I'm sure it'll come to me in a minute. He lived near my house too. He lived about 5 miles from me, and I called him on the phone. He let me come over, spend some time with him. John Buscema, thank you.
Oh, yeah.
Nice, super nice guy. But, I was really lucky like that. Ron Barlow had published, he knew Ellie Frazetta, Frank Frazetta's wife, and they lived in Stroudsburg. You know who Frazetta is, of course. I don't have to tell you. And he lived in Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, where he had this little storybook house in the woods that looked like a Frank Frazetta house. I think he designed it. And that's where the Frazetta Museum is now. And we went to Stroudsburg because Ellie was at the local Holiday Inn, had set up a gallery of all of Frank's paintings in person. Up until Ellie took over, Frank used to give his stuff away. Ellie put a stop to that. But we saw Ellie, and it was amazing to see the work. And she said, if you want, you could come over to the house after. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to meet Frank Frazetta. And so Ron and I spent the afternoon at their house just hanging out with Frank and talking about all kinds of stuff. That was really, really amazing. Every time you meet someone like that and you shake their hand or you're in their energy field, you're absorbing a little bit of it. You're hoping anyway, He had a stroke. You know the story about his stroke, right?
Oh, Frazetta?
Yeah. There's a documentary that came out on him that goes into it. And he had a stroke, and he couldn't, it was his painting arm. And what did the guy do? Like within a year, he retrained himself to paint with his left hand.
Wow.
And it looked almost as good as the stuff he was doing with his right hand.
That's amazing.
The guy's a genius. Good looking guy too. I mean, he looked like an actor.
Huh.
And you could find pictures of Frazetta and Ellie when they were in high school together. And he rode a motorcycle, and he had the pompadour like West Side Story, and he was a tough guy. I mean, he looked a lot like his characters, very muscular.
Yeah.
Amazing guy. I'm driving off the cliff here, huh?
No, not at all.
Oh, no, it's all right. So when you worked on those Gold Key comics, just to bring it back, when you worked on those Gold Key comics, you said that they let you go through all the pages and like correct dialogue. Was there anything else that you got to have input on? Like maybe was some, room in the Enterprise, did it look wrong?
Oh,
you
sure.
were like,
I provided, since I was the Federation Trading Post, I provided them with all kinds of reference to try to pull it, more towards the show.
Awesome. Was there anything that you wanted them to put in those issues that didn't make the cut?
Well, I mean, I thought the stories were goofy, the two stories that I worked on,
Well, yeah.
So I wasn't, and I wasn't, I was only in my early 20s. I wasn't going to tell them that I thought the story sucked or anything, but you don't want to hurt the writer's feelings too much at that point,
Right.
I mean, if I was an editor and I was going to get in trouble if it was wrong, I would be tough, but I'm not getting paid for it. They didn't pay me. Yeah. Everyone wants something for free.
Right.
I see Harlan Ellison sometimes where he's talking about how like Paramount or whatever will call him up and say, we're doing a video on City Under Forever. And it's, as a matter of fact, there's a documentary, I think it's Dreams with Sharp Teeth or something. You should see it. You haven't seen it. And he talks about how they call him and they want him to do interviews and he won't do it. He says, cross my palm with silver, he says. And I understand. Hey, that's his choice. I do every interview that I can because it's good for Star Trek. And that's, I care more about that for some crazy reason. I care more about Star Trek than I care about my making a buck for some stupid reason.
Yeah. It's a good thing to care about.
Yes.
Yeah. So after Gold Key, you ended up getting into Star Trek, but that was after you had already started working in film a bit.
Well, we also did a magazine that called the Star Trek Giant Poster Book.
Oh, I've heard of that.
While we were at the Federation Trading Post, and because people would come to the store because we were the only place, where all that stuff was collected. And Fiona Press wanted to do a Star Trek. They had been doing poster books, where on one side of the poster it was all articles and it opened up, and then the other side was a big poster. And they came into the store looking for reference or photos, and we sold slides and things like that. And we said, we could do your magazine. You wouldn't have to worry about any of that. We've got everything here, and we know everything about Star Trek. And they said, okay, just like that. And we ended up having this magazine. And a lot of people consider it to be a classic. It certainly was. It may have been the very first Star Trek magazine, regular, periodical. I can't think of. We even predated Starlog.
Wow.
Yeah. So we were doing that, and there's some good stuff in there. And we had our own slide collections. I collected slides from Lincoln Enterprises. I still have 2 big binders. They're all turning magenta because that's what happens as years go by. But those were good. Those are, if you ever get a chance to take a look at them, I'm proud of those. I'm just surprised at how many people, are like, oh my God, you worked on the Star Trek poster book. I remember when they were doing the first Star Trek movie, I saw pictures of Fred Phillips doing makeup in the makeup room, and one of our posters was on the wall, Wow. So that was a big thrill. When they first started doing the very first movie, Star Trek: The Motion Picture, of course, it went through different phases. For a while, it was going to be phase 2. Then it was going to be a TV movie. Then I guess Star Wars hit big, and that's when Star Trek became a big budget film, a very misguided film. A lot of crazy stuff going on in the background there. They had false starts. The original director was a guy named Phil Kaufman, who went on to do The Right Stuff.
Oh, yeah.
When the budget went sky high, they said, we better get somebody who knows how to work with a big budget. I'm sorry they didn't keep Phil Kaufman. I would have liked to have seen where he would have gone with that.
Yeah.
And they brought in Robert Wise, which really was kind of in the twilight of his career, But Jeff Mandel, who did the Officer's Manual, when they were doing Star Trek: The Motion Picture, we actually flew to L.A. on the off chance that we could sneak on the back lot. We actually called everyone we could call. We made phone calls to the art department. Remember, we talked to Lee Cole, who was a graphics designer on Star Trek: The Motion Picture, and she's. I ended up working with her in the art department later on, and I remember reminding her of that, and she didn't remember it at all. But then I brought in a letter that she wrote for me on the spot, recommending me. And but we basically got in onto the back lot. Howard Anderson was still there, and we called Howard Anderson. They did visual effects for the original show, and bullshitted our way into a tour of Howard Anderson. And so it was like after we got done with Howard Anderson and the Star Trek art department, they were like, well, you guys can see yourselves out, right? And we were like, yep. And we just stayed on the back lot all day long. And we got to see bits and pieces of sets. That was the first taste, I guess, of what Hollywood was like,
Yeah.
And where did it go from there? Oh, yeah. I started working at an architectural supply in Manhattan called Charette. And they were having a Christmas party. No, it was a Halloween party. That's what it was. And I had been collecting articles on how to do foam latex prosthetics. And like I said, you couldn't just go on the internet and type in, or go to YouTube and write LifeCast and come up with 1,000 things on people doing LifeCast. Then it was like, well, I saved this article from 2 years ago where some guy in a magazine, I think it was called Cinemagic, which at the time was still a fan publication. I think that Starlog eventually did it as a magazine, but it was originally something you would find self-published in a comic book shop. Right. And I collected articles like that, and Planet of the Apes was, when it came to prosthetics, that was like one of the cool things. Mm-hmm. Everyone started doing apes. Is how you got started back then. You do a Planet of the Apes makeup. And I had this article, and I said, I think I could do this. I'd never sculpted before. And from that article, I learned how to do, the rudimentary mold making and do a life cast, get foam rubber that you'd bake in the oven that would go into the mold. And I'll never forget, I put that makeup on out at the party. And man, when I had that person in costume with the makeup on, and it was uncanny. I had this creature in front of me that didn't exist before. It was a Planet of the Apes ape, and everyone was like blown away by it. And I knew right then and there that this was it, that I was going to do makeup, and that was my way into the, show business. And that's what happened. I found out that I started doing stuff, and a friend of mine who is still a friend of mine, and I see at the Star Trek conventions because he helps Creation run their, audiovisual stuff. A guy named Doug Murray, who wrote comic books. You remember the Nam? Vietnam? Doug Murray wrote that.
No way.
I was out at his house, and he had all kinds of collectible stuff. And I showed him what I was up to, and he goes, I just did an interview with Dick Smith. I'm going to give you his telephone number. Now, Dick Smith, anyone will tell you, Dick Smith is like the greatest character makeup artist who ever lived. He did, The Exorcist,
right,
and Little Big Man, and the old Salieri and Amadeus. And I mean, just incredible work. Anyone who was a makeup artist in my era and after probably was inspired to do that by Dick Smith. So it took me like 2 weeks to build up the nerve to call him, which I did. And it turned out he lived 15 miles north of New York City in Larchmont. And I started sending him pictures. There was no internet, so you sent pictures over through the mail.
Right.
And we chat on the phone. And when I called him the first time, he literally kept me on the line for like an hour, giving me information, where to get stuff, And so 3 months later, I as a matter of fact, I was in the middle of mixing plaster to make them old. And my wife says, Doug, Dick Smith is on the phone. And I just left the bucket and ran over the phone. And he asked me if I could come work on The Hunger. It was a David Bowie, Catherine Deneuve nouveau vampire film, which really was, Whitley Strieber, I think, wrote it. And it really was the beginning of that kind of, vampire chic. It really was.
Right.
But it was an incredible movie to start on because it was there were like 4 stages of aging for David Bowie to be really, really old, crumbling mummies and puppet heads. And so that was the beginning of my career, being in business. That was it.
Yeah. And I would say you've done quite a bit of like aged makeup over your career,
well, I mean, I ended up partners with a guy named John CAG Leone, who was one of the Northeastern clique that all orbited around Dick Smith. There was an East Coast group of makeup artists and a West Coast group. And Dick was the East Coast, even though the West Coasters admired him as well. And once I got hooked up with John through Dick Smith, we did got to do lots of makeup, which culminated, of course, with Dick Tracy. And that was 14 years of doing makeup. And really, I'll tell you the truth, I don't know how anyone does one thing for 40 years, 45 years. I just can't. I can't do that. There's so many interesting things around. Every, 7 to 10 years, I would go, wow, I really want to be in the art department, or gee, I want to get into the visual effects department. And the beauty of Star Trek, especially the Star Trek that we were involved with, the Roddenberry era of Star Trek, the shows I was on, ran for like 17, 18 years. And when you're on a show that long, you get a group that is a well-oiled machine, and everyone knows everybody, and they look out for each other. And once I had been on the show for 3 years doing makeup, I got to know everybody else. So it wasn't that difficult to move sideways on the show. I got to know Mike Buda. We hit it off, and he basically got me into the art department. So I did scenic and graphics with Mike, and I was an illustrator on the show after that, and ended up in the visual effects department and makeup. And I don't think there's anybody who's worked on the show who's worked in more departments than me. Yeah. What a lucky guy.
Yeah. So the reason that I brought up aging makeup is what I had in mind specifically was like, you did a lot of the aging makeup in the Inner Light, didn't you?
Yes. The makeup was designed by Mike Westmore. He sculpted it. He had the wigs made. He did all of that. He wanted me to put it on.
Oh, I see.
So I would apply the makeups, which not anybody can walk in off the street and apply a prosthetic makeup.
Right.
It's very tricky. So Actually, the very first makeup I did on Patrick was he had a bit part in a holodeck sequence with it was a Shakespeare thing that Data was doing.
Oh, like God, what
He's
was
one of
that?
the King's Men or something.
Right, like
And that's the first time I really
Henry
got
V
to know
or something.
Patrick. And he was delighted with the makeup, and I couldn't believe that I'm standing on stage with Patrick Stewart touching up his makeup. And after the makeup, after I had to take him out of it, and then they have to put him back as Picard in his uniform, do some green screen shooting for when he phases out of the holodeck, and I'm standing there with Captain Picard, touching up his his regular corrective beauty makeup, and he's talking to me going, Doug, really wonderful job you've done, and blah blah blah, and I'm like, holy crap, Captain Picard is like telling me I felt like a crewman, But yeah, when Inner Light happened, I put on all those makeups. Mike gets the credit for designing them. I just put them on and painted them and blended them in. But that was a wonderful experience for me because I got to spend a lot of time with Patrick.
Right.
I remember there was that Russican flute that he would play that tune on.
Yeah.
He actually had like a penny whistle that he would rehearse it on so he could look like he really knew how to play. And it would be like 2:00 in the morning, and I would be taking him back to the makeup trailer to get him out of his makeup. And, walking through the ghostly alleys of Paramount at 2 a.m, where no one's around, and you're walking from pool to pool of light. It's very much like a graphic novel.
Right.
And Patrick was playing the flute. So those are like out-of-body experience things,
Wow.
that you get the business for in the first place.
That's crazy.
I'm lucky because I've gotten to do a lot of stuff that looking back on it was fantastic when it happened, but looking back on it's like, wow, I've collected all of these, I could die happy,
Yeah.
So many wonderful things have happened to me. I don't know how I got so lucky. Like I said, I'm probably bleeding out at the age of 18 on the side of the road somewhere. My brain's just giving me what I always wanted.
Yeah. Life flashing before your eyes, yes.
Well, I'm pretty sure I'm real, so I think you're real too.
You sound like
I'm not so
Forrest
sure about
Kelly
myself,
at City Manager Forever. That's quite all right, my dear, because I don't believe in you either.
Right.
Yes, I know my Star Trek a
Yeah.
little too well, but it served me well.
Yeah.
I'll tell you that when I came to Next Generation, I'd just come off like one of the biggest shows in Hollywood. And then especially when we were nominated for an Academy Award, that I was one of the people who could be a geeky fan and get away with it on stage because they thought I was a celebrity.
Right.
And I knew that it wasn't for most people, it wasn't a good thing to do that because the show had experiences where fans broke onto the back lot and stole uniforms and things like that.
Right.
And so if you acted too much like a geeky fan, they'd look at you sideways. Are you the one who's letting people in? You know what I mean?
Okay.
There's a video on the YouTube you could find. I think it was Greg Stone. I once in a while we chat on the internet. Back then on TNG, he and another guy snuck on the Paramount backlot, and they slipped onto the stage. And then after wrap, they came out and videotaped themselves taking a tour of the ship. The guy was wearing a Starfleet uniform too. But the thing is that at the end, you'll hear the security guard yelling, "Who's there?" And the camera's like running, you can see the point of view of the camera. And they jumped down under the warp core and they hid under there till she went away. And then it was stuff like that, like I said, I had just come off like a really big, important show, and we were nominated for an Academy Award. And so I didn't care if anyone knew I was a big fan. I would gush about performances to actors and, and how much I love the show and stuff like that. I get away with that. But most people didn't do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's quite all right. I'm kind of enraptured. So when you switched from makeup to design and effects, like one of the things that I personally love that you've been doing a lot of is a lot of CGI stuff. Now, did you have to teach yourself how to do that? Did you take classes? Was it trial by fire? You're just like, oh, I guess I'm doing CG now, or, how did that work?
Well, the thing was that I guess I was in the 6th season of DS9, I think. And things were shifting over to CG at that time. I could see the writing on the wall, at that point, I guess Digital Muse or Foundation Imaging were starting to get some CG stuff when they had huge battles like Sacrifice of Angels, where you just couldn't do it with models.
Yeah.
And, I could see what was coming. I mean, there were a lot of people who were associates of mine, rather than seeing what was coming and grabbing it by the horns, they would kind of put blinders on. That's never going to happen. And, there wasn't really much chance that I did work on Voyager, but there wasn't much chance that I'd be able to jump over and be a regular in the art department because they were fully staffed. I'd come in on Voyager to do things here and there, from DS9. So I'm thinking, what can I do? And I knew all the visual effects guys, and I knew that they were starting to use CG. And so about a year out, I picked, Mike Okuda had a copy of Lightwave in his office.
Oh, yeah.
And that was the program they were using back then. And I would, go in, and Mike and I were good pals, and we'd sit and chat. And I'd pick up that box and look at the pictures on it. And then finally one day I said, hey, Mike, are you ever gonna? And he goes, no, I really don't want to climb the learning curve. And I said, would you mind if I? And he goes, no, take it. And so I took it home and I started playing around with it. And I started using it in the department for designing, which at the time, I think nobody was doing, really.
Yeah.
Now computers and CG programs are, that's their main tool for doing paint overs and things like that, and blocking things out, and because you could change the light and in minutes. So just as DS9 was ending, I think I mentioned to Dorothy, my wife, that I had seen an ad from Foundation Imaging. They were going to do a show. It was a CG version of what was called Roughnecks.
Oh, Starship Troopers.
Starship Troopers. And they were looking for artists. And I saw that. And I said, hey, Dorothy, there's Foundation Imaging. A guy named Ron Thornton, this is his company that he started, and he did visual effects. He was one of the first guys to do CG in a television series, Babylon 5. And of course, it looked like CG at the time. But, had a slight game edge to it. And Dorothy goes, Ron Thornton's like an old friend of mine. And I'm like, what?
No way.
She called him up, and they worked together in the past. And I went up to Foundation, and Ron hired me on the spot. I was a novice doing CG, but I had been proven to be someone who could, been through numerous departments and had a track record, and he hired me instantly. So I went right from DS9 to Foundation Imaging, where I started on. I went up there for Roughnecks, but there were two guys who were big Star Trek fans who were doing Voyager. They were the CG supervisors on Voyager, Adam Leibowitz and Rob Bonchoon. And when they heard I was upstairs, they came running upstairs, and they wanted me. So I ended up on Voyager right away. And it was a great experience because they were, they were willing to take the time to show me how to do stuff.
Awesome.
And so that was the beginning of it, really. I mean, I'd been doing it for about a year before I got there, but until you're really in the frying pan and your life depends on it, you don't really learn things.
True.
Yeah.
To be in a tough situation is like the best thing that could happen to you. So I was at Foundation Imaging for 2 years, where I did end up. Actually, it was funny because I was on Voyager, and these people, Ron, take people through Foundation Imaging for tours of the facility. And he would always bring them by my desk because he would be able to say, this is Doug Drexler. He's an Academy Award winner. That's a good thing to be able to say.
Right.
And he told them that I used to do character makeup and Dick Tracy and stuff like that. And they said, gee, that's really interesting. How did that happen? So how'd you get into this? And so I told them the story I told you. And I could see a light go off over Ron's head and why it hadn't occurred to him before. And after they left, he came back and he said, have you ever done faces in the computer? And I'm like, no, I don't even have an idea how you would do faces in a computer. It's like knitting, And he says, I want to transfer you over to Roughnecks for a little while. And I was doing characters for Roughnecks, and I had a different approach than all the other guys who were painting faces for the computer. They had no practical experience. You know what I mean?
Right.
They'd never painted a face that would be on stage, that would be lit, that, you know. So, I mean, I painted from a totally different point of view. Their faces, although these guys are really good, they tended to look a little bit like department store mannequins because, you know, at department store, you put one coat of paint on and then you put some blush on their cheeks and the tip of their nose and their lips, and that would be it.
Right.
I would go in and I would paint veins and, you know, paint the structure underneath the skin because, you know, a CG head, there's nothing under the skin. And in real life, light passes through skin, it diffuses. There's deep areas and there's high areas. So you have to fake that, like when you're doing a prosthetic makeup, because when you do a rubber face, light is not diffusing through the skin and reflecting back what's underneath it. So we would have to paint that in. You know, you got to paint in bone structure. First your base coat, then your structure, then your, you know. So I did pretty good at that. I was surprised. I ended up, after doing that for a while, I ended up going back to Voyager, and I knew they were talking about doing Enterprise now. You know, I really wanted to go back to Star Trek, but I wasn't sure I wanted to do graphics and scenic again. I had done that for 7 years. You know, I get to a point where I don't want to do the same thing over and over. And Herman Zimmerman and John Eves were working on the design of the NX. And John must have done like over 30 designs that were all good. But they, you know, as long as they have time, they'll keep making you redo things because they don't know what they want, but they'll know it when they see it, which is, you hear that a lot. And they got to a point where Herman and John had to move on to the sets. And Mike Okuda said, you know, why don't you have Doug come back and he could bring what he knows about CG now and design it right here. And you would have animations, not just drawings, that you could take to show Rick Berman. And so that sounded great. I definitely wanted to do that. So I ended up back on the show. And I'm sure this is the first time that it had been used in an art department like this. And you know, you're able to do animated designs. The thing I have to say is that if you have an illustrator who's really wonderful, that person can take a turd and make it look fantastic. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Technique. When you do CG, you're really looking at it very much like it's going to be on a screen. There's no hiding, you know? I thought if you look back at Matt Jeffries, who was a production designer on the original show, and you look at his paintings, he's a good artist, but he's not a flashy illustrator. And if you look at his sketches, like in a Star Trek sketchbook, all of Matt's stuff is very kind of crude, really. And I have to say that there's actually something to be said for a guy who has an artistic eye, but whose sketches tend to be on the crude side, because there's no hiding behind technique. Matt had to come up with real incredible concept ideas in order for it to look decent in his kind of his folk art looking drawings. I mean, look how the Enterprise, 50 plus years, still looks ahead of the curve. That's crazy.
Yeah.
It's inexplicable. I'm actually teaching a course at Art Center this semester in Pasadena, which is like a real, one of the top design schools in the country. Almost a lot of entertainment artists come out of there. And I doubt very much. I told them, I said, I don't think I could have gotten in here when I was in my 20s, but because of my experience,
Right.
And so basically what we're doing is talking about restyling a cultural icon. How do you do that? Yeah. It's a minefield. I think that they've messed it up in the last few incarnations of the show, But anyway, blather away, Doug.
So what was it like working on the NX-01?
Oh, my God. I mean, can you imagine? You'd think getting an Academy Award would be enough. But, to get to design an Enterprise?
Yeah, I can't imagine.
Wow. That's really incredible. It's the most carefully thought out of all the ships. I mean, we had it designed right down to the airlocks before it made the air. And none of the other ships were like that, And what I love about it is that, now, I don't know if you've ever seen the NX refit that I designed.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was the first time. First, I love the idea of no secondary hull because because here was an opportunity to grow the ship
Hmm.
and show an evolution taking place. And I think that a lot of fans who didn't like the NX in the beginning, when they saw that there was a plan, all of a sudden, when I did the refit, a lot of people became fans of the NX who were not fans in the beginning because they saw that we had an idea and they love ideas. So yeah, I had an absolute ball. I was, I had a total free hand. I mean, of course, you have to work with Rick Berman, Brandon Braga knows people, But yeah, that's like one of the biggest thrills of my life. It's ridiculous. How did that happen?
How did it happen?
I don't know. It's
Well,
like crazy. It's supernatural. That's why I think I must be dead.
Yeah, there was a motorcycle accident when you were 18, and
Yep.
have you? Speaking of like just how well thought out the ship was, I'm curious if you've seen those blueprints made for what's called the Enterprise project.
Is that Waxing Moon?
Yeah, that's the one.
Incredible. Well, we've communicated. He doesn't pass anything by me. I'm not sure why, actually. If I was him, I would. I think he's done a wonderful job. He doesn't do everything. He hasn't done everything exactly the way I would have, but he's doing a beautiful job, I think. And it's really honored that he would take that amount of time to do all of that. He doesn't, the drafting is great, and he has a lot of respect for it, and I think that's really cool.
Yeah. I remember seeing that thing for the first time, and thinking like, wow, this is really great. It's like a color version of the old Franz Joseph blueprints, and then like that moment when I clicked to zoom in and you realized like what resolution he was working at, I was like, oh my God, this guy is like way involved in this.
Oh God, yeah. No, it really is. It's amazing. It's amazing. I think it's really cool.
Yeah. One thing, just like kind of a fan curiosity I've been wondering for a while. Do you still, because I've heard that you made a little paper study miniature of the NX-01 when you were designing it, and do you still have that?
I made that for Dan Curry.
Oh, yeah?
It was about this big. I basically printed out top and side views and sprayed them onto foam core, spray glued them onto foam core and cut them out and stuck them together with hot glue. And that way Dan could go to a production meeting and hold it up and say, we shoot, we want, or go talk to the CG guys and be able to talk about angles and shots and things like that. I don't have it. I don't know if he has it anymore.
You should find out.
Definitely.
But yeah, that was fun.
Yeah.
Dan's an interesting guy. I was on Enterprise till it was canceled. But seeds had been planted for my next evolution myself. That when I was on Deep Space Nine and I started playing around with Lightwave, I felt this presence behind me while I was building something, and I turned around and Gary Hutzel was standing there, and he's like this.
Oh, wow.
Huh. And he says, how would you like to build a ship for me? Because Gary was a supervisor on the show, visual effects supervisor with Dan Curry on the show. Gary and Dan both were the kind of guys who, they didn't just stand around and say, oh, move that over there and stuff like that. They would actually shoot the shots of the ship and set up motion control, the physical models themselves. Gary knew how to do all of that. And so when CG started coming in, he was no longer able to do that anymore. He would go to the facility and explain what it is they're looking for, and then come back, like 4 or 5 days later. And if you're lucky, they'll do what you asked. But more often than not, the person at the facility says, I've got a better idea. I'm not doing that. And then Gary would come in and it's not exactly what he wants. And so there was a lot of fighting going on. And I remember Gary would call me after meetings with the facility just to bitch. And then one day, he's standing behind me while I'm doing CG, and he thinks, how would you like to do something for me? And I'm like, heck yes. So I built a model with him, and Gary was a great guy, very funny, and we had a similar sense of humor. And I had a great time, and I remember saying to him, wow, that was really fun. After it was finished, I go, I hope we get a chance to do this again. And I remember Gary looks at me and he says, be careful what you wish for.
Huh.
And then after DS9 ended, Gary went and did Battlestar Galactica, the Edward James Olmos Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah.
And I saw that first season and I was like, holy crap, this is an amazing show. And not only that, Gary has taken something that's becoming rather creaky, spaceships flying through space, and supercharged it. And that was because basically Gary saw what Steve McNutt, the DP, was doing with handheld cameras and snap zooms. And he says, I'm going to apply that to space shots. And all of a sudden it was like, and ever since then, people have copied what Gary did. I mean, when I saw the first Star Trek movie, they literally copied what Gary was doing on BSG in the battle scenes and stuff. And J.J. Abrams himself told David Icke, who was a producer on Galactica, that's where his inspiration was from.
Yeah.
So after Enterprise got canceled, and of course, they didn't tell us. We found out on the internet. I remember driving home, and I'm thinking, wow, I've been on this show for like just about 17 years. I go, my sack of luck must be down to the bottom by now. I'll probably never work again. And I got home, and Dorothy meets me at the door, and she says, there's a message from Gary on the phone. I'm like, oh my God, he's going to ask me to come to Battlestar Galactica. I know it.
Right.
Pull him up. And Gary's in Vancouver. And he says, I heard about Enterprise. I go, yeah. And he says, but every cloud has a silver lining. And he invited me to the show. And I went right from Enterprise to BSG. And working with Gary for those years is like, I mean, how many amazing opportunities can you have? I mean, it's like ridiculous.
Yeah.
Now I had a different ship downstairs. It was a Battlestar. And that freaking hangar deck with those full-size Vipers. Wow.
Yeah.
Just incredible.
Yeah. Up here in Seattle, they have the Sci-Fi Museum.
Yeah.
And a few years ago, they had the opening of the Battlestar exhibit, and they had Ron Moore and Eddie Olmos, and even was it Glenn Larson? Yeah, Glenn Larson.
Oh, was he there?
Yeah, he was there, and just a bunch of the actors, and it was cool meeting them and everything. But what really struck me was when you went upstairs and you saw that full-size Viper, and you're like, what?
Well, the thing was that on Star Trek, we didn't have very many amazing shuttlecraft. They would, unless they had a movie budget, they would end up having flat sides and, to keep them inexpensive. So when I saw these beautiful compound curves on these Vipers, and it was just, wow, they cut them out of foam. And, in Star Trek V, one of the best things that come out of Star Trek V were those shuttlecraft that they built, full-size shuttlecraft. And TNG inherited one of them. And Rick Sternbach did a restyling of it where it was cut down to be shorter and styled to look like TNG. And so at that point, TNG had a fantastic shuttlecraft. They gave one to Scotty at the end of Relics, I guess.
Yeah.
And actually, I have a funny story about that. I was still doing makeup, and I was walking down the corridor. There was nobody else there. And Mike Okuda comes around the corner. And so we stop and we chat. And I said, hey, Mike, what do you think the possibility is of me, coming to the art department? And I remember he looks around both ways to see if there's anyone listening, because he thinks we're going to get geeky. You can't do that. And he grabs me by the arm, drags me down the hall to the shuttle bay doors, which also doubled as the holodeck doors. And he put his fingers and prod it apart, pull those heavy doors apart. And when you look inside, it's shuttle bay 3 complete.
Oh, wow.
And sitting in the middle of it is that shuttlecraft with the back door down. And all of the consoles are lit.
Whoa.
So it's like a complete world. And so we go in the shuttlecraft, and Mike gets in the pilot seat, and I get in the co-pilot seat. And when you look out the window in the front, the windshield, there's the hangar deck. So it's like, oh my God, you're on the Enterprise and you're in a shuttlecraft and it's complete.
Right.
And we start chatting, and he explains how we don't want to get too geeky, and you never know who's listening, and they may not trust you. And so we're hiding in the shuttlecraft to have this covert conversation, and I realize that we're recreating a scene from a classic science fiction movie. And I said, "Hey, Mike, do you realize we're doing that scene from 2001 where
Right.
Bowman and Frank they're hiding in the pod so that Hal can't hear them?" And he looked at me, and we both burst out laughing. And we knew that we were kindred spirits for sure by
Right.
then.
So really quickly before we move on to anything else, it just occurred to me, since we were talking about CGI and Enterprise, were you at all involved in the CGI Gorn in A Mirror Darkly?
That was done at Foundation Imaging. I was back in the art department by then. I believe it was sculpted and animated by John Teska, who's an amazing artist. I think he's at ILM now. The design, it was designed by Dan Curry, the visual effects supervisor. And I thought they did a great job.
Yeah, I was wondering how they telegraphed the scene, how they got Bakula to do all the fighting moves, and the choreography behind all of that stuff was interesting to me.
Yeah, it was, and of course that was another episode where we got to recreate the original series.
Yeah.
Now we recreated the original series twice. We did it in Trials and Tribulations, which Mike Okuda and I are experts on the original series. So, I don't mind taking some credit for production designing that show.
Yeah.
And then when we did the mirror through a mirror darkly for Enterprise, we got to build the full bridge, and a lot more than we got to build last time. And see, now there's the thing. When J.J. Abrams does his era of Kirk and Spock, there's no respect at all for what happened before. He's going to do it his own way. When we did the original series era, we treated it as if it was a masterpiece. And we recreated it as close as we could to the original. And it does not look dated. Even though we all know that we've got technology and stuff and, immersive VR in the early 2000s. What happened on the original series is kind of primitive,
Yeah.
But we're still able to do those designs, and people go with them and believe in them because there's a certain honesty and truth to the the design. But now you talk about high points on those shows, and those were high points to get to build those sets. Now, James Cawley in Ticonderoga, New York.
I was just there.
Oh, well, I mean, Okuda and I have gone and given basically seminars on the sets, taking people through them. And we're going to do it again, I think, this fall. I had a hand in James starting up all of that stuff and was involved with, I'm one of the godfathers of Star Trek fan films.
Yeah.
When we did Trials and Tribulations, James Cawley, who is an expert on the Star Trek uniforms, almost anything original series, had talked to Bob Blackman several times, and Bob knew that James knew more about the uniforms than anybody. And so when we were going to do those shows, Bob and James were talking because Bob knew where to get the double knit polyester. The company that made the collar material is still in business. You could buy a bolt of that, And so James wants to talk original series. And Bob appreciates the original series, but he's not like a geek,
Right.
And he said, if you want to talk original series, you really should talk to Doug Drexler. So he put him through to me in the art department. And we hit it off, of course. And at the time, James was saying, I'm starting to build the turbo lift alcove, and I want to build Scotty's station next to it. And so I sent him whatever blueprints we had. And I also, and a little later, I sent him the graphics for every panel on the bridge that I had done. But when he started building it, he started sending me pictures of the turbo lift alcove. And I'm going, James, when you do your, and of course I was just starting in CG,
Yeah.
I said, when you do your episode, I'll do shots for you of the ship. And never thinking he would. Little did I know. But they ended up doing these episodes, and the early ones are rickety, but they're still, I was deeply involved with one of them, and it was a lot of fun, and it moved along really good. And there was no YouTube at the time either. You had to go to like the torrent site or something to download it. And I remember Joss Whedon in an article talking about fan films, he said that he had watched that episode that we did and said that he was glued to his chair watching it. That was a great compliment from a guy like that.
Yeah.
But I cameoed in one of the episodes, and one day Herman comes into the office, Zimmerman, the production designer, says, Doug, have you ever heard of a Star Trek? He got the name of it wrong, but I knew what he was talking about. And I'm thinking, a cold hand closed over my heart. And I'm like, no, man, I don't know anything about that. And as he walked out, I realized I had just lied to Herman. And so I followed him into his office and closed the door, and I said, Herman, yeah, I know about it. Actually, I left out one part. Before that happened, Barrett Heiderman, who was our PA, was in the production office, and he heard somebody talking about it. And then he went down the stage, and he saw that visual effects Ron Moore was sitting in a tall director's chair with a laptop, and they're watching the episode. I'm going, oh my God, I'm fucked. And I go down the stage, and sure enough, they're sitting there watching it. And I'm standing next to Ron Moore. And I did the scene where it was the Franz Josef space station opens up and the Enterprise comes out. Oh, yeah. Ron looks at me and goes, they never let us do anything that cool. Like, so then when Herman comes in, I'm like, look, I thought maybe 200 people might see this thing. There wasn't a YouTube yet, it's going viral. That term had not been invented yet, And I told Herman, I go, yeah, I was. He says, well, I was in the production office, and Mary Howard, the producer, the show, watched it, and she said that you were in a scene. And I looked at it, and I said, that's not Doug. And it was. So Herman says, Mary may want to have a chat with us. And I'm thinking, oh, my God, what if I get fired? I've never been fired in my life. Now I'm going to be fired from my dream job. And so I figured she's got a lot on her plate. A few days go by, and I figure it must be off her radar. She's got better things to do. And then Herman comes in and says, Mary wants us over in her office at 1:00. And I remember looking at Mike and Denise, and they're thinking, I ain't coming back.
Right.
And walk across a lot, feeling like dead man walking. Walk into Mary's office, and Mary gets up and shakes my hand with both hands with a smile. And I'm thinking, that's not bad, not a bad sign. And I look over, and there's two gals sitting on the couch. They're Paramount lawyers.
Oh.
But they get smiles on their face, and they're really friendly to me. So, okay, we start chatting. And it turns out they're Star Trek fans, and they thought it was really cool.
Huh.
And they said, we just want to make sure that you're not using any Paramount content to do these things. And I say, well, all the shots of the ship and stuff, it's CG. And at that point, no CG had been done of the original series by Paramount.
Right.
So it was all stuff, I had to pull together. And they were like, okay, well, that's all we really wanted to know. Now, if you were to do it again, and I said, wait a minute, what do you mean if we were to do it again? Are you saying we could do it again? And she said, well, we can't actually give you permission, but we can look the other way. And that was the blossoming of Star Trek fan films.
Yeah.
Which really, really, a lot of Star Trek fan films were happening, and Paramount was okay with it, as long as you weren't making any money on it.
Yep.
But then we had the big, brouhaha over Axanar.
Right.
Where I think they raised like $1.5 million.
Sounds about right.
And the thing is that you don't think Paramount's going to look the other way on that, do you?
No.
I mean, there's a certain point where it is no longer a fan thing when you're pulling in money like that. I mean, look, what if Warner Brothers says, well, we're going to do our own fan film? We're going to put $20 million into it. It's like Paramount, they had to draw the line somewhere. And unfortunately, Axanar, I mean, I know a bunch of those guys over there, and, but I hate to say they took advantage, but in a way they took advantage, and I don't know where it went wrong, but it created a big fuss, and, there was a court case and the whole thing. And so the kibosh has been unfortunately, put on fan films. There's still stuff being done, but there's very strict rules now. I think it can't be more than 15 minutes.
Yeah, it's short.
So, but anyway, that was my contribution to, I was even interviewed by Variety, I have to say, in the early days about what I thought about this. And I told them I thought that this is like a training ground for people. There are people who are going to be involved with this, who are going to go on to be grips and designers and stuff like that. So I thought it was a good thing, really.
So on a non-Star Trek topic, and we can deviate, I think Ian and I discovered that I think I remember back in the 80s, growing up in the 80s, we had HBO when it first came out, and they always had a lot of movies they showed over and over. And I think Ian stumbled onto the fact that we were both big fans of Chud.
I knew you
Yes.
I remember watching that movie so many times.
Chud is like the damn funniest thing. I did it with CAG Leone. He was the primary designer of the Chud. They had some ideas. Really, John was responsible for the designs of them. And I had just joined up with them. Actually, we had done another goofy horror movie before that, Amityville 3, which was shot in Mexico, and that was a lot of fun. But then when we came back, we got Chud. And we did it out of his basement, on Long Island. And, you know what kind of movie it is. And there was a long time there where I didn't even put it on my resume,
Wow.
But since then, so many people grew up having fun with that movie that they flip out when they find out that I worked on Chud. So yeah, Chud's on my resume now.
Yeah.
Even Homer Simpson. There was an episode of The Simpsons where they were going to New York, and Homer said, "But what about the Chuds?"
It was a creepy film, though. I mean, I remember those little light up eyes that they had.
Yeah, you know what that was? That was Scotch light. The eyes were, we vacuum formed the eyes, and then we got Scotch light that you would have like on stop signs.
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
and
okay.
it's like tape, and you put it on there, and then they have a beam. They call it a beam splitter that goes on the camera and shoots a beam of light to light up their eyes. I use that again. I use that in a Michael Mann movie, Manhunter. Do you ever see the Manhunter?
Yep.
There's a scene where what's his name from? See, Manhunter was really like the pilot for CSI. We had Bill Peterson there. He has this thing where he goes into the house where the murders took place. He says, "I enter the house. The air is cool against my skin, blah, blah, blah. I go into the bedroom. I see Mrs. Leeds in the bed, and you see her like he's seeing her. He's living it. And she rises up out of the bed, and her eyes are glowing." And back then, like now, that's like no big deal in a computer.
Mhm.
Nothing to it. But then you had to do it practical. See, I feel I was lucky because I went across a period where stuff was being done practical and then computers came in. So I got to experience both. So to make her eyes glow, I had to make appliances of eyes that went over her own eyes. And I put Scotch light in the eyes, and they put a beam splitter on the camera, and her mouth glows too. I put a piece of Scotch light in her mouth. But, I mean, I worked I think probably one of the last replacement animation gimmicks in movies was in a movie called Starman that John Carpenter did.
Yeah, I love that movie.
It's a great movie. I think it's one of his best movies.
Yeah.
It's got real heart, There's a scene where the alien finds a strand of hair in a photo album of her dead husband.
Yeah.
And uses that DNA to grow from a zygote into like a baby. And then there's like a head and shoulder shot where the kid kind of forms into Jeff Bridges. And did that with Dick Smith. And Dick asked me to come work on that. And we had to make 140 full-size dummy heads that full size with eyes and paint and everything. And each head was a little bit, it started with the kid, and we grew it one at a time towards Jeff Bridges. It took us 6 months to do that.
Wow.
And
just for that one shot.
Yeah. And, that was all physically done. It's amazing how far we've come in such a short period of time.
Yeah.
It really is. How about that neck stretching stuff from Chud?
God. Well, that was Kevin Haney's idea, and it wasn't even in the script. I remember that, Kevin tends to get enthusiastic, and he starts running off at the mouth. I mean, I learned later in my career that don't go spitballing ideas like that unless you're willing to do them,
Right.
and because they're not going to give you more time and they're not going to give you more money either, And so John and I are looking at Kevin running off the mouth, and when we left the meeting, we said, "You're doing it." And actually, I have a funny story about that. I helped Kevin, even though we all decided it was his thing, so he was going to do it. And we had this material that BJB made called Skin Flex. It was really stretchy. You could put elastomer in it and make it super stretchy. So Kevin had this idea. He was going to build this puppet head that had shoulders, and that the head skeleton would have a rod on it, and you could push it and stretch that neck. So Kevin is working on it, and, pulling all-nighters and stuff. And I remember it was the day to go on stage. And Kevin is still fussing with this thing. He's the sharp teeth, and he's got a Dremel, and he's sharpening the teeth. And John's going, "Come on, Kevin, it's done. We got to take it in." And it's like, "No, another minute." And, I could almost see this happening because I saw it in an old Don Martin cartoon one day at the dentist, where the guy got his lip caught in the drill and his whole head was like a spaghetti spun up on that. And that's exactly what happened. Just like in the Don Martin cartoon.
Oh, man.
The lip of the chud got caught in the drill and it spun around and it tore. And Kevin, when he saw that, he almost lost his mind. I mean, he screamed. And I remember John grabbed that thing and threw it in a box and said, "We're going to the set and you're going to make it work. And I'm going to help you make it work." And he had like Kevin under one arm and the chud head under the other arm and jumped in the van and drove into Manhattan where they were shooting it. They made it work. Okay.
Yeah.
Kevin was the sound of the chuds.
Really?
Oh, really?
Yeah. He used to do Wookiee noises. He would take a cardboard toilet paper tube and shove it in his mouth and make noises from the back of his throat. Yeah, just like that. And he could make all kinds of noises. And we were in a production meeting. They were talking about what's the voice of the chud going to be like. And we all said, "Oh, get a toilet paper tube. You got to hear Kevin." And he made these noises and they were like, "That's it." And so Kevin was the chud noises. Yeah, chud.
Did you find that working with those kind of constrained budgets made it more interesting, more challenging, more fun? Or
well, I've often found, and it was true with Star Trek as well, that when you don't have a big budget, you have to be clever instead.
Yeah.
I think they had a problem on the first Star Trek movie because they kept throwing money at it.
yeah,
And you need to have constraints to be creative sometimes. Not always, but working in the business is all about problem solving, and rolling with the punches. And if you're not good at having monkey wrenches thrown into your plans and dealing with it, then you can't be in the business. The best laid plans of mice and men.
Right.
So I mean, in every segment of the business I've been in, that's what it's been about. It's always about working within, very narrow bandwidth, and also dealing with people who either things go wrong or you get a crazy director who's going to change everything at the last minute, or everything that he approved of yesterday morning.
mm-hmm.
You get on stage, he goes, "Why did you do that?" "Well, you said." You get directors who are bipolar sometimes, But you just have to learn. You just have to know how to deal with it, and not to lose your mind.
Yeah.
You could either relish it and grow with it, or you could go crazy and pull all your teeth out.
Yeah. Something that I say when I teach some programming classes, and something that I always like to tell my students is that, the best way to learn something is to have a project in mind or have something thrown on you, and you just have to kind of scramble to figure out how to use the tools to make what you want to make.
You never get as good as you could be until you're in a life-threatening situation. I mean, I've been in so many of those, and they're not fun at the moment sometimes. But then when you succeed and you survive, that's such a major part of working in the business. That, like I said, if you can't do it, don't try to be in the business. I run into people who come out here, don't make it, then they go back home, and then they tell stories about, "Oh, there are a bunch of phonies out there, and It's plastic, and they're all evil in Hollywood. Well, generally, those are people who couldn't make it, so they have to blame it on somebody else.
Right.
Honestly, the people that I've met since I got into the business, so creative and so resourceful. It's been a great trip for me. I have nothing but respect for Hollywood, and it doesn't have anything to do with the fact that I've been successful. It's just honestly, it really is.
Well, Doug, we've been here for about a couple hours now, and
I know.
It's
well, you see that you could talk about it for days.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I think we
But
could.
if you ever want to talk again, I'm always pretty much available.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So like we said earlier, the next time we want to talk to you, we want to kind of talk specifically about those 2 issues of Gold Key, if you would be so kind.
Oh, sure. We didn't really talk about it too much, but I don't know how much there is to tell, but I'll answer all the questions you've got.
Okay. So we on our usual episodes, we go through the story, and Ian and I will both have points that we pick out that we want to discuss, and we kind of it evolves into longer discussions about particular parts of the issue. So, we'll have a battery of questions and observations, and we can just kind of riff on that stuff.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, Doug Drexler, thank you so much for spending all this time with us and talking about all these Trek and non-Trek topics.
And Chud.
It's
Chud.
And Chud. You come full circle from my childhood here talking about Chud.
Chud.
But
Wow.
Thanks so much, and we look forward to talking to you again in the very near future.
Okay. Well, listen, thanks for thinking of me.
Of course. And Ian, anything you want to say in closing? Or?
Man, I just wanted to say it was a real pleasure, and I can tell because my cheeks are sore from laughing and smiling so much over these past 2 hours.
That's great. I love to hear that.
Yeah.
Well, thank you guys.
Oh, of course.
It was fun for me too.
And that brings the 33rd episode of Drawing Trek to a close. If you're looking for us online, you can find us at thetricordertransmissions.com, at Tricorder Show on Twitter, and facebook.com/thetricordertransmissions. We also have a Patreon page at patreon.com/thetricordertransmissions. If you like what we do here on Drawing Trek or on any of our other Tricorder shows, please consider becoming a patron. We would really, really appreciate it. And thank you all once again for listening to the Tricorder Transmissions. We'd love to hear back from you on social media if you can find us on Facebook or Twitter. We'd love to talk to you about this episode and all of our other ones. So thank you so much, and we'll see you again next time. Hi there, thanks again for listening. If you're cruising the galaxy looking for even more Trek talk, why not visit our good friends Bill and Dan over at TrekGeeks.com? They've got a great podcast that covers a wide range of Star Trek topics, so you're sure to find something you'll love. And if you're in the mood for some awesome tunes, then you really need to head over to 5yearmission.net. The guys are writing a song for every episode of the original series, and each one is absolutely brilliant. So that's TrekGeeks.com and 5yearmission.net. Check them out today.